So let's move on to Redshift now. Again, I'm going to show you what a brief setup looks like, and then we'll switch gears to Karma. When we go to our shader, right now I have this smoky shader happening for our plume. I would recommend taking the scatter section and making the absorption be some sort of factor of it. So in this case, I'm taking the scatter coefficient amount times 0.8. So you always want to think about how much scatter you have with how much absorption is created. It's not really the best idea to, let's say, just only affect the scatter coefficients or only affect absorption when you're trying to add more or less smoke. Those should always be a fraction of one another. So, as an example, if let's say you wanted to add more smoke, one thing you don't want to do is take this absorption coefficient up to something super high and think that that's the best way to get more smoke. It's really not. I mean, this has kind of a decent look to it, but as we look at the overall behavior of things, it can be difficult to control. So let's say that I took the scatter coefficient up to 50, something really high. You'll notice that everything got really bright. So now I'm forced to go down here and compensate with more absorption. And so what we'll find is that if you want more smoke to be present, if you want the smoke to be thicker, then always just, again, make the scatter coefficient and the absorption listen to each other and bring up both of their values at the same time. So again, I'll right click on this, copy parameter, paste a relative reference, and we will multiply that times 0.8. There we go. This is a much better way of controlling things. Now, if I generally want more smoke without letting things get too glowy, I can just turn this up and I have more smoke without those issues. Or I can turn this down at a value of 10, and it all works throughout the entire thing. Now, when we go to the Advanced tab, people often turn the shadow density scale too high. And so let's bring this back to 15 real quick. If I turn this to something like 2 and I overdrive it, we do have a lot more contrast happening with our smoke. But we also lose out on the scattering. And that scattering makes things feel really glowy. And so the hard thing about this shadow density scale with Pyro is that you want to have the glow affect the volume, but you also want the contrast and detail. So it's kind of a balancing act, but I tend to find that if you go lighter on the shadow density scale and you go higher on adding overall smoke, that seems to work out much better. You still keep some of the scattering in there, but you can have more contrast and detail, and that is pretty good. Again, if we take that down to 0.2, we can see this happening even more. So what I'd say about that in general is when it comes to pyro and explosions with Redshift, keep your scatter coefficient high and your shadow density scale low, and that'll cause things to glow throughout the plume. Now, if you don't like the brightness of that dust, we can basically turn that down through the absorption. And so it's all kind of a balancing act, but this is a much better way of going about all of that. Now, down here at the emission, I do have this ramp set up kind of similar to what we saw in Pyro 2, where we're cutting off the top with black, and we're also cutting off the bottom. And if I set the scale here to something pretty high, like 50 or 100, it's good to overdrive or really make the scale really hot and intense. Because if you were to look at reference footage, the highlights actually do clip out on explosions. They're not there for very long, but they clip out. And so going on a high value with the flame is usually a good thing to do in most situations. It'll also add more glow throughout the entire pyro plume. So that's a good thing as well. Let's go back to our advanced, take this down to 0.4 again. And one thing as well that's good to keep in mind is the values that we're sourcing in with the density and the emission. So one trick that I do that works pretty well for figuring that out is you can go to the very bottom where all the fields are, and you can create a volume slice of any field. Let's say density, right? We will go here to density, and we can then use an attribute promote to promote the maximum value. So if, let's say, we take density, promote the maximum value right there. The original class is a point. It looks like the new class should be a detail. Then go to our geo spreadsheet, detail context. We actually have a maximum value for our density, and that's really good. So if we do that for all the fields, we can then take this data right here and use that to drive the ranges that are being detected by the shader. So I'm talking about the old min and old max. Right now we're seeing that density is around a value of 50, so it actually makes sense to go from 0 to 50 as the old max, and then fit that between 0 and 1 so that we have better control over everything. Likewise, we can take a volume slice of flame right here and promote that as well. So let's change the attribute here to flame and go right here with flame. And we can see that the value is 0.31. So in our material context, under the smoky section, our old max should be around 0.3 or 0.4. I would overshoot it just a tad bit, but that usually is pretty good. Once we do that, everything gets a little bit out of whack. So it's also nice to go back to the Advanced tab, and I sometimes play around with the new max. If you change the new max, especially on Emission, that tends to do fairly well in controlling the overall effect. So if I turn down this max here, we have less flame. If I turn it up, we end up overdriving everything. So let's go probably around 2. That seems about right. And then we'll also need to add some more smoke. So we can take our scatter coefficient up, maybe 100, or we actually take this down and then we take our flame down as well. Maybe that's the better move. Again, it's nice to have a lower scatter coefficient because then you get more of that glowy effect. So let's try 25 on this guy. It's going to look super glowy, but then we'll take our flame down to 25 as well. And actually that's a bit too low. Let's try going up to 50. And one last thing, go back to the advanced. Let's take our new max here to 1.5 and our shadow density here to 0.5. And that seems to be a pretty decent area for all that detail. But again, the real key here for getting the volume to glow naturally with Redshift is to keep a higher scatter coefficient, lower absorption, and then you can go ahead and also keep those values kind of on the lower side in general to get even more scatter. We'll come back to Redshift later, but that's a very basic setup on how to get going in the shader as it stands right now. We'll revisit Redshift towards the end of this course, but now I'd like to switch over to Karma to give you guys an idea of what that workflow looks like.